Can the Panasonic S1 II unseat the Lowlight king? This is the Sony a7S III, which shares the same sensor with the FX3 and FX6, and it has really been the undisputed king of high ISO performing cameras since 2020. But this new Panasonic S1 II has a really impressive partially stacked sensor that has also been used in the Nikon Z6 III, and Panasonic has been known for years as a company capable of squeezing every single bit of performance out of a sensor, and whenever you start cranking up the ISO, you may be surprised at how well the S1 II performs in low light against the a7S III. It's time for a low light test of the high ISO king versus the up and comer. Also, if you want to learn more about how to use either of these cameras, I want you to know that I have a full pro video guide that I made for the a7S III, and I'm working on one for the S1 II as well, and I will link to these guides down in the video description, as well as to my free filmmaker gear guide that will show you all the equipment that I recommend for filmmaking. Now, I have both the a7S III and S1 II in my studio here. The Sony is recording in S-Log3, while the Panasonic is recording in V-Log, and I'm not going to be color grading any of the footage recorded, which will make the noise more visible for you. We can't hide it with color grading here. You're gonna see it. For the Sony in particular, I'm recording in XAVC-HS 4K, which is an H.265 codec, and arguably has the best quality footage that you can get from the camera. To be clear, there is another codec called XAVC-SI, but in all my low light testing over the years, even though that codec will make larger file sizes, which you may think are higher quality, the XAVC-HS codec has slightly higher quality noise reduction and should look better at higher ISOs. Can you see why I made a pro video guide course for the a7S III? Because you're going to learn useful tips like that. Anyways, for the S1 II, on the other hand, you have a lot more codecs to choose from, including H.265 like Sony, but you also get ProRes and ProRes RAW. That said, to keep things identical and as real world as possible, I don't know of many filmmakers that actually record in ProRes all the time. I think most filmmakers are going to be recording in H.265, and that also helps us match up the a7S III with the S1 II more easily. So for the S1 II, I'm going to have it set to the MOV H.265 format in 5.9K resolution. Yes, this is noticeably higher resolution than the 4K that the a7S III is capable of recording in, but I also don't want to introduce any weird issues where scaling down the image from 6K to 2K in camera on the S1 II could result in lower image quality, because that sometimes happens whenever you downscale an image in camera. So I will be downscaling the image in post, which may actually make the noise seem less intense, but that's also what you'd be doing if you were editing on a 4K timeline. So I think that's a good way of doing it. Anyways, ground rules out of the way, you'll be pleased to know that both these cameras start at the same base ISO of 640, and as you can see, the image may look clean and noise-free, but it's also extremely dark. Side note, by the way, you may notice that even here right off the bat, the S1 II image looks brighter than the a7S III, even though all the other settings are identical, and I'm using lenses that are both set to f2.8. The reason the S1 II is brighter, and this will become more apparent as we increase the ISO, is due to Panasonic raising the shadow levels higher in V-Log than Sony does in S-Log3, which you may be thinking, hey, that's going to make things brighter. But what you need to be aware of is this also comes with the downside of increasing the visibility of any noise, because noise usually hides in the shadows. Just keep that in mind as we continue through the test, and moving on now. Up first, you have ISO 800, which is looking good. Then you have ISO 1250, still looking good. ISO 1600, no issues that I can see here. ISO 2000, maybe a hint of noise showing up. ISO 2500, we're still cooking. ISO 3200, which, keep in mind, if you had a Panasonic GH5, this would be the max ISO that I would recommend, because it would be too noisy, but the S1 II is handling it like a champ, thanks to it being full frame with a much newer sensor, so that's not super surprising. Here's ISO 4000 now, which starts to get a little interesting, because this is arguably one of the noisiest ISOs of the camera, due to it being the ISO level right below the second base ISO of the camera. It definitely isn't unusable, but there's also definitely some noise appearing with the S1 II. Shall we clean up that noise? Here we have ISO 5000, and I want you to notice that while the a7S III is starting to look a bit noisier, the S1 II just got significantly cleaner, because ISO 5000 is the second base ISO for this camera, meaning that anything you film at ISO 5000 will look just as clean as if you filmed it at ISO 640. This is really useful if you're filming in darker conditions, and one of the reasons that I love the dual base ISOs of both of these cameras. Let's keep going now. Cranking up the ISO to 6400 with a bit more noise on the A7S III. ISO 8000 now is starting to get more interesting with more noise, but I want to press on to ISO 10,000, and here it is. Now, I want you to notice that the A7S III is looking quite noisy at this point. And fun fact, this is arguably one of the noisiest ISOs of the A7S III because this is right below the second base ISO of the camera. So as a tip for you, if there was one ISO I would not recommend filming with the A7S III, it would be ISO 10,000. And if you want to be really careful, I would also avoid ISO 8000 as well, because these are where the camera looks its noisiest, and you don't want noise. You didn't buy either of these cameras for noise. No, you want clean, pretty video. Check out my A7S III Pro video guide if you want to learn more tips like this. Anyways, here is ISO 12,800, and look at how clean the image looks on the A7S III. While the S1 II doesn't look bad, the A7S III looks extremely clean, and that's because, as I just mentioned earlier, ISO 12,800 is the second base ISO of the A7S III, and other than ISO 640, this is the one ISO that will be the cleanest with the lowest amount of noise. And this is also where you kind of have a choice to make between the S1 II and the A7S III, because while the S1 II's second base ISO of 5000 is significantly lower than the second base ISO of the A7S III, this may end up being more usable for many filmmaking situations, because if you need to turn up your ISO to 5000, it's probably pretty dark where you're filming, but whenever you compare that to the much higher base ISO on the A7S III of 12,800, I find that if I want to shoot at that second ISO, I sometimes need to use an ND filter to make sure it isn't overexposed, because 12,800 is really bright. There's such a gap between 640 and 12,800 that can sometimes be difficult to expose between these 2 points on the A7S III, while the jump in base ISO on the S1 II from 640 to 5,000 is more manageable. That said though, if you are someone who commonly finds yourself filming in very dark conditions, maybe you're always filming at night, or you're maybe a wedding filmmaker who's commonly filming wedding receptions in very dark conditions with less control over your lighting, that is where you may find yourself preferring the higher second base ISO of the A7S III. So the choice is really up to you, and if you're considering between the S1 II or the A7S III, or maybe the FX3 or FX6, because remember, those cameras all have the same sensor with the same low light capabilities as the A7S III, I would highly recommend thinking about what you're commonly filming and which one of these cameras makes more sense for you. But all that said, we ain't done yet. It's time to start getting into even higher ISO levels now. And everything above this point I would categorize as an extreme low light situations where things are incredibly dark and you absolutely need the camera sensor to absorb the maximum amount of light. At first you have ISO 16,000, which, keep in mind, we are now triple the base ISO of the S1 II and only one notch above the second ISO of the A7S III. But honestly, I think both these cameras look very good and this footage looks extremely usable. The same can also be said for ISO 20,000, and even whenever you bump things up to 25,600, they're still looking pretty good. This is where you do start to see more noise creeping in on the S1 II versus the A7S III, but not by much. And I still think that ISO 25,600 is completely usable for both of these cameras, which is pretty wild to say. Bump it up to ISO 32,000 now, and to my eye, the Sony sensor is still looking about as clean as it did at 25,600, while the S1 II continues to deteriorate slightly, but like I said, still usable. ISO 40,000 now is the same story, with noise in the shadow of the tree starting to become a bit more pronounced, but I know what you're waiting for. Let's get to the big number here. Here you go. This is ISO 51,200, which is the maximum ISO that the S1 II is able to reach, and I have to say, even with this camera not being marketed as a powerhouse, low-light performing camera, even at its maximum ISO level, I think that you could still use this if you were filming in very dark conditions, which definitely feels weird to say, considering that when I started filmmaking many years ago, I remember my early Canon DSLRs looking like an utter turd at anything over ISO 3200, maybe 6400 if you were feeling really brave and wanted to denoise your footage and spend hours waiting for it to render. But here we are with both these cameras, looking quite good at ISO 51,200, which is really impressive. Shall we continue though? Because remember, while we have hit the maximum ISO for the S1 II, The a7S III sensor's over here like, whoa bro, hold up, that was just a warm-up. Let's get to the real workout. Here we go. And I'm gonna keep the S1 II footage on the screen at ISO 51200 so you have a nice baseline as the Sony continues to skyrocket into the stratosphere of ISOs. First you have ISO 64000, which for context, on the predecessor of the a7S III, the a7S II, this was the maximum ISO that I would usually feel comfortable pushing the sensor, where it was still usable without denoising, but I do recall going higher for one wedding, where I was filming a couple outdoors with nothing but moonlight to light them, but we'll get to that in a second. For now, the a7S III is like ISO 64000. What else you got? What about 80,000? Still trucking right along, but let's get to the next big one. Here we are, ISO 102,400, double the maximum ISO of the S1 II, and more importantly, this is what we'll call the quote-unquote maximum standard ISO of the a7S III. And what I mean by that is that while this camera can go higher, anything above this level is where Sony is going to warn you that things are going to get noisier and the footage is going to start to fall apart. But as you can see, even at this ISO level, I would still call this usable. And I've had this discussion with many filmmakers in the past few years where they asked me, Matt, what is the maximum ISO you would feel comfortable going to on the a7S III or FX3? And I would kind of look at them funny because I would essentially say, all of them? Like with other cameras, you would have to stop at some point. But with this sensor, if you need to crank it up to 102,400, you'll be fine. It's insane. And Sony made something really special with this sensor. But I hear you now saying, Matt, show us the extended ISOs as well. Sony fanboys are looking down at the S1 II in the dirt, laying there all beaten up, and a voice is crying down from the heavens like, finish him, with the Mortal Kombat accent. And there's a random Nikon Z6 III filmmaker over here that uses the same sensor as the S1 II saying, stop, stop, he's already dead. Sorry, though, we have to keep going. Up first, you have ISO 128,000, and two things are really interesting in this shot. First, I want you to know that we've started to reach the point where the footage is actually starting to become overexposed, especially behind the plant. We've finally reached the point where even in such a dark room, things are overexposing, which is pretty crazy. And second, notice how things start to look a bit muddier in the footage. Detail is starting to get lost, things aren't quite as crisp, and remember what I said, this is an extended ISO. This is Star Trek and Captain Kirk is telling Scotty he needs more power, and Scotty's saying, I'm giving it all she's got, Captain. But they always find more power and push the ship even harder. Congratulations, we have reached that point. Up next, we have ISO 160,000, which we are well over triple the max ISO of the S1 II, and things are looking a bit noisier with a bit less detail, but for context, we still have 4 ISO levels to go. Here is ISO 204,800, and we are still chugging right along. ISO 256,000 is getting pretty muddy, pretty swampy, losing a lot of detail. The image is breaking apart, just like the Enterprise at this point in the dark reaches of space. Let's get to the end here though. ISO 320,000 now. We're on the cusp of the maximum low light capabilities of the sensor. Where is it though? Let's get to it now. Here it is, the maximum ISO that the a7S III is capable of filming in, ISO 409,600, which, hey, we're losing a lot of detail here, but if you look at how overexposed this image is, the light is just a big white orb of overexposure in the middle of the shot, the noise is dancing on the plant leaves, and we've lost a ton of sharpness. But whenever you look at this shot next to the S1 II, which remember, is at a very respectable 51,200 ISO, the Sony ISO is so significantly brighter, it's insane. As I've clearly showed you, the Sony sensor inside the a7S III, FX3, and FX6 is still the low light king, but Panasonic is putting up some pretty impressive high ISO numbers with the S1 II, and if you are looking for a camera that excels in low light, I think both these cameras are going to perform incredibly well for you, and the choice of which one you go with from an ISO perspective is going to come down to whether you want a camera with a second base ISO that may be more usable for general filmmaking, like the ISO 5000 on the S1 II, or if you commonly find yourself filming in extreme low light situations often, where a second base ISO of 12,800 makes more sense. If you're a wedding filmmaker in particular, I still think that the a7S III and FX3 come out on top because you're commonly going to be needing to hit those high ISO levels at a wedding reception, but the margin of Sony winning is pretty slim, especially considering how good these cameras looked even at extremely high ISOs like 25,600, 32,000, 51,200, etc. They're both great. You can let me know which camera you like better down in the video description. And while you're down there, I would love if you would check out my Sony a7S III Pro video guide, as well as my FX3 Pro video guide and my S1 II Pro video guide, which is coming very soon. They're all linked down below. With that, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.